If I were a recruiting leader, I would be early adopting to be able to illustrate and demonstrate to my teams the art of what's possible with what they do have access to. But then I would probably be spending 25% of my time investigating tools and looking for what is the right fit for my company.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm Johnny Campbell, CEO and co-founder of Social Talent. And this week, I'm really excited to be joined by Jeff Bettinger of Hudson RPO. Jeff is the Chief Administrative Officer of Hudson RPO. And this week, we're diving into a conversation about AI and how AI is pushing TA leaders in arguably two different directions. And we want to dive into those directions, challenge them a bit, and talk about perhaps what direction they should be going in. But first, I'd love if Jeff, if you could introduce yourself to our audience and maybe explain that role. It's not a more typical role, Chief Administrative Officer. You could share what that means and maybe give some context as to Hudson RPO, who you are, and some of your own career as well. That'd be wonderful, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Johnny. Appreciate the brief introduction there. So, Chief Administrative Officer of Hudson RPO. Hudson is a recruitment outsourcing organization where we have global and even very, very regional players that come to us and look for our help in recruiting talent for their organizations. A lot of times companies choose RPO because of the expertise that we bring to the table. They choose RPO because we bring cost efficiencies that they're not able to find. And we bring often technology that helps organizations to really kind of step into the next level. I was actually a consumer of RPO in my career. I have a very, very untraditional career path, Johnny. I started as a school teacher and I did that for about a decade. And then I decided I wanted to make maybe just a little bit more money than school teachers make. So I made a shift and, 25, 30 years ago almost, I became a recruiter. And I started frontline recruiting for an organization that was into heavy engineering and project work around the world. I was recruiting, project managers and cost engineers and electrical engineers, accountants, just the whole gamut. And really, really loved it and rose through the ranks. And over the years, made a few strategic moves in my career. Eventually headed up as the chief HR officer at two different companies. And then Hudson RPO came to me and asked me to come on board as the chief administrative officer. So under my remit, Johnny, I have HR, legal, facilities, and then I also have our IT function. And, actually there's been some news lately about companies that are bringing IT and HR together because there's so many things that, work together and are dependent on one another in that space. But it's been a really wonderful journey. I've been here about 14 months. Hudson, of course, is, 30 some years old. We've been doing this around the world very, very strongly for a lot of different companies. And so it's, my role to kind of keep off of the operational leaders, a lot of the back office administration that you need in an organization to kind of keep it up and running at a very swift pace. And so if there's something of an administrative thinking and it usually gets thrown into my court, and then we look for ways to solve the problems.
So, Jeff, thank you for that. And actually, it's a really appropriate tee up for the conversation. As you've been in conversations, I've been in conversations, and we've been in conversations together around what does AI mean for recruiting. And largely, I think what we both see is that you have folks who are on one side of the camp, which might be AI is going to help us deliver hiring at such a lower cost, faster, et cetera, et cetera. And so we see AI as automating everything. And, you hear stories, particularly in hourly hiring, where you're able to deliver instant hires with no humans. The cost goes down to near zero, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side, there's an argument that says AI is going to make hiring finally deliver at the level it's always promised to. We can add so much more value, be more strategic, really align hiring to business goals, to talent plans, etc. And so the question becomes, if you're investing in an AI tool, which of those two philosophies are you aligned to? Are you doing it to try and cut costs? Are you doing it to try and drive value? And probably as an RPO, many might expect that you're going to sit on the side of drive cost, because there might be a perception that you're trying to deliver as optimal a service at the best price, which, I certainly have seen the former with my experience working with Hudson over the years and other RPOs. I see arguably some of the highest levels of excellence in hiring because there's such a scale model, and because there's no room for inefficiency. You tend to see real best practice. Over the years, when folks ask me which company does recruiting best, I'm like, well, it's not really a company like you think. It's probably an RPO provider. That's where the excellence lies, which surprises some people. So with that as a kind of jumping off point, maybe could you share with me the conversations you're having, and maybe, begin this, debate around these two sides of this argument?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real dichotomy that we're seeing starting to emerge, because there's this suite of tools that is completely changing the footprint, the game plan for recruitment. And the early adopters are gaining quick advantage, and those that are not adopting are really losing ground, probably at an exponential rate. Johnny, one of the things I love about you and your background, running and owning social talent as the CEO, is you understand the role of a recruiter. Most people that run into some sort of an HR technology and go down that route are really technologists that try and learn something about a business or learn something about processes within an organization and try and design to that. What I love about social talent is you've built this with recruiters to help recruiters really make progress. And so you understand some things about the recruitment process and what we've, lived over the last many years. I remember going back to my very early days, you used to talk about the power of a recruiter's Rolodex, and that was really everything. And you didn't find a lot of recruiters that did a broad swath of a lot of functions. A lot of times they had to be more specialized because the power of their network was really the value that the recruiter brought to the equation. And so when I would be recruiting recruiters to come work on my talent acquisition team, very early on, what I was always looking for was the power of their network. What were the tools that they were using that gave them the leg up or the advantage over other candidates that I was looking at? And almost always it was just the power of their personal database.
Mm.
And whether that database was electronic, whether it was physical, really at that time didn't matter very much. And over the years, we've seen this, I'll call it a 20, 25-year technology revolution, that we moved a long ways with a lot of incredible tools where the playing field got leveled for recruiters. But at the same time, the recruiters that learned how to use those tools, especially, the LinkedIns of the world and so forth. And now it's just become such a vital tool. That's all people have. And I think we're seeing that 20-year, 25-year metamorphosis right now happen in 2 years, 18 months, where the technology is moving so fast. It puts recruiters, I think, in a position that they have to make a decision about where they're going to be and what they're going to do with these tools, because it will either give them incredible power and strength to deliver at the highest possible results, which is this one side of that equation. But then on the other side, it's the constant fight that HR is overhead and talent acquisition is largely viewed as an overhead function. And so whether it's in an organization or in an RPO where we specialize in recruitment, we see this challenge that people are having because the business is saying, use the tool to drive down cost. People in my industry and in recruitment are saying we need to use the tool to drive down cost. And I think that that's true, but the driving down of cost really still is on the back of an incredible recruiter that learns how to use the tools. You know, in the early days of my recruitment, for me to get an understanding of another company's benefit package so that I could have a conversation with a candidate about the advantages to our total rewards versus another company. I mean, it could take me weeks of talking to candidates from that company to just pluck out the information so that I could put together a little table to, you know, be able to talk about what things were and find that value proposition for future candidates. Now I can do that in 4 minutes. And you know, you jump back 8 or 10 years ago, I could do that in a couple of hours with some good research on the internet and some look at Glassdoor and some things. So as we think about the dichotomy, I think we're heading to a place where we may lose some recruiters that are maybe a little bit lazy and aren't really going after the ways that they will be able to add the value. Because I don't think it's going to end up being either or. I think it's going to end up being somewhere in the middle where the recruiters that really use the tools and organizations that really use the tools that are becoming available are going to gain the advantage. I don't think it's about replacing recruiters. I just think it's about them being able to deliver better outcomes with enhanced advisory capabilities. And that to me is a place that we as a function, the talent acquisition function, we've always we haven't served the business as well. There are fewer recruiters capable of that deep consultative advisory than there are recruiters who just really love to get the resumes, put the butt in the seat, and on we go.
You remind me of a situation. I used to recruit accountants, Jeff. Started my career recruiting accountants for industry. So a lot of management accountants, some chartered accountants running kind of factories and so on and so forth. I used to love the industrial side, but I always placed accountants. And over the years, you know, we've had our own accountants and social talent. And I remember somebody working for us a few years ago who was sharing with me the great news that our costs had dropped and we're below budget in a certain area. I was like, pardon me, that sounds brilliant. Walk me through that. And they dove through. It was like, well, we've saved a lot of money in sales expenses this quarter. I was like, oh, brilliant. Our sales expenses are down. Why are they down? And we dug into it. The sales expenses were down because sales were down. We weren't paying commissions because we missed our sales numbers. And if you're the accountant who just celebrates the fact that, yes, this cost went down, we're winning, you lose the big picture. I think the same goes for recruiters who have been living in a very functional way and saying, you know, our recruiting leaders more to the point saying, we're driving costs down. So the cost of recruiting needs to go down. Whereas I had a conversation with a recruiting leader during the week who is challenged with this. She works in a financial services organization and her board want to see recruiting bring costs down. Like that is the metric that she is literally tasked with, which leads you to the kind of side of the camp, I imagine, where you're thinking about AI to drive costs down. And I talked to her about, no, let's frame this. If we can, for example, I wrote an article about this last week, if we could frame this that by upskilling your recruiters to be better talent advisors, and as part of that, the subset of skills being better negotiators, could we try and make sure that we are offering salaries at closer to the median range of our expectations and not at the higher range, which is where we are today? Because if you were to shave $3,000 off every offer, by the amount of folks they hired, the cost saving massively outweighs the entire TA budget. And that's aligning with the strategy, which is to save money and save costs, which is a perfectly legitimate strategy. But it's being smart as a TA person. For example, the accountant not celebrating our sales costs going down because, you know, that's not the objective. If doing less sales will reduce your sales costs, of course, but that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to make better margins. And so you start thinking about what the business is trying to do. I think to your point, you can align your activities with the business goals, but just you got to reframe it. So I think there's we talk about a lot about how the recruiters need to behave. But what do you think is the role of leaders in making these business cases and framing these conversations the right way, Jeff?
I mean, it's powerful. I'll share a couple of experiences that I've had kind of doing the same thing. And I think one of the things that I want to call out, though, to kind of create context is that in my career, especially being mostly a talent acquisition guy, there's not a lot of people who graduate from university and say, I'm going to go be a recruiter. That's what I want to do. That is what my life is going to be. I'm going to dedicate my life to that. a lot of people end up in it a little bit by accident. And because of that, I think that we have not done a great job internally as a function within, the array of functions, the constellation of functions that are in the business world, to really, really educate our recruiters in such a way that they can become that business thinking, aligning to the strategy. I mean, that's one of the things I love about social talent and what you're doing, because what you're helping our recruiters do is become that talent advisor, that talent consultant. And I remember I was called in literally to the CEO's office of a, you know, major organization that did medical device. And it was, I think, November, December that year. And they said, "We have a real crisis." And I said, "What's the crisis?" I said, "We've sold about $40 million worth of X machine that's now been placed in doctors' offices, and we don't have enough field service engineers to go out and start up and attach and connect and, put all the equipment together. And then we don't have enough trainers to go out and teach the doctors how to use the machine." And in their particular organization, their rule was they wouldn't realize the revenue from the sale of that machine till a doctor had performed 10 procedures on the machine, because
Wow.
they knew then that the doctor was fully trained, that it was fully hooked up. So this organization was missing out on a potential, 30, $40 million revenue enhancement because they just didn't have the right talent out there and hadn't strategically worked on trying to close that gap. And so the CEO gave me a task and said, "We need this gap closed within 6 months. We have to close this gap." And, so I put together a whole plan and worked with all the regional leaders around the world. And we went into just overdrive, focused on this one particular part of the business where we really dove in on a regional level as to what the challenges were. We changed sourcing strategies on how we were looking for these talents. And within about 4 months, we were able to hire the number of people needed and put them into the training process, that the organization never again had that overhang in the annual cycle. And because of that, because I was able to show the executive team that we had figured out how to help the business close a $40 million gap, it just there was never a question about cost in recruitment
Mm,
anymore.
mm, mm.
We didn't ever have to go really fight hard for elements of a budget, because we were able to frame things through this shift in cost reduction to no, 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 no. We're revenue generation. And here's how we generate revenue. We did the same thing with pharma reps at another organization. We took total sales, divided that by the number of reps that we had, and we knew, and then divided that by the number of work days in a year. And we were able to come up with a figure that our sales reps were worth somewhere in the neighborhood of about $11,000 per day that they were in the field selling. And so as I was able to take metrics then and show them, and time to hire back when I started recruiting was literally just you wrote a date on the file, and when you filled the role you looked at the next date and you figured out how many days it was in between. And now there's tools that can do that. But now with AI, I can go in and say, what's the average time to fill for this type of a role, and what can a person expect if I'm hiring for that role in Edinburgh, Scotland, versus if I'm hiring for that role in Johannesburg. And it will help me to hone in on information where I used to have to track all that manually. But point being, I was able to go back to leadership just a little while later. And this was when I had actually made a decision as a talent acquisition leader. I need to bring in experts. I need to bring in an RPO, because they, just the training, the expertise, kind of like, your home, you maybe have a little teeny thing that might be going on plumbing wise and you decide you can go fix it yourself. But when you really have a big thing you need to worry about, you call in the professional. And that's why companies often go to RPO. That's why I chose RPO. I said, I've got to find a way to bring our time to fill on these sales reps down by 20, 30%. At the time that I came into the role, back then, we were at 63 days to hire a single sales rep. And over the course of about 12 months, once we implemented RPO, we got that down to 40 some days. And so when you think about that for a minute, we were cutting 20 days off the hiring process at a value of 10,000, 11,000 US dollars per day. So in essence, by the end of a month time period or 2 month time period, I was able to go back and say, because of the 19 reps that we hired at 20 days less, we've brought the business a $4 million revenue opportunity that they wouldn't have had. And that consultative thinking that we really need our HR talent and talent acquisition talent to have is really just emboldened by the use of AI. You can put the administrative things to it, and then you can spend the time really researching, thinking through, and working with the business on how to solve the business problem and reframing this whole conversation. But again, Johnny, we're seeing it just like you are. Procurement organizations, finance organizations, and HR organizations, whether corporate or in our industry, they are, this is a cost savings. We're going to find a way to make a cost savings. And then what will happen is, unfortunately, the least productive recruiters will find themselves having to probably find other type of work, because those that have the most productivity and take advantage of the tools to make them the most consultative, they'll be indispensable.
Well, connect those dots, right? Because I think we're both in very broad agreement around the framing of recruiting, not as a cost center, but more as a value-added activity. And from leader right down to frontline recruiter, we should be having conversations about the value create, not the cost of the delivery of the solution. But connect the dots between AI and our ability to be more consultative, more value added. What have you seen so far? You hinted at it in terms of AI giving you the time back to be more consultative. So talk to me through some of those examples, if you have them, or where you think AI can be a smart investment that allows us to be more value added.
I mean, I think there's a race right now among providers to figure out what can we give the marketplace that helps give us a strategic advantage. And there's some early movers, Paradox being one. I mean, Adam and his team, what an incredible tool, to be called out by a CEO on a, shareholder investor call with the tools that are being provided. I mean, there's some fantastic things happening in that space. I know that recently, and they're still in the pilot, but behind the scenes, LinkedIn's been working on, and they'll roll out their hiring assistant. But what they've seen across the companies where they've done their early pilots is like a 40 some percent higher acceptance rate of AI crafted emails, for instance. And so, back in the day, I mean, I sound like I'm trying to go back to covered wagons, but back in the day, every message was handwritten, carefully crafted, you know, tailored to the conversation that I'd had and the information I could find. Now I can take 6 resumes of the 6 candidates that I want to approach first, dump the 6 resumes into my AI tool and say, write me a personalized outreach email for each individual, highlighting for me 3 key characteristics that they have expressed in their resume that match the job description and why they would be a good match for this company, right? A prompt like that, now all of a sudden I've got 6 emails ready to go. And if it's copy and paste, right, if I'm in the LinkedIn tool where they have built-in AI automation on some of the, connection things that you can do, you're putting together work at such a fast rate. It allows you to do the deeper dive into being very consultative with the candidates that you're working with, so that you can really bring the very best of their skill sets forward. It lets you have more time to really uncover from the hiring manager the real issues and things that they need to do. I was watching a podcast just yesterday where a chief HR officer had actually made some of her own agents profiles within a GPT of each member of their executive committee. And they would go and they would consult with that artificial intelligence executive committee where, she'd put in what their personalities are, their histories, their backgrounds. So she was able to then figure out what are their objections I'm going to see. But a recruiter could be doing the same thing. I'm working with the hardest hiring manager that the company's ever had. No recruiter lasts longer than 3 months. Here are the things that bother the, and you just can use the tool to augment your advisory skills. So, one way might be writing emails, right? Another way might be just doing deep market research. I've had a few times where I've had to go out and hire people who um, would be patent holders of various technologies. And now, back then I would literally at times have to look in patent office records to try and figure out who are these people. But now I can put technology, with a good prompt, talking to my AI tool and ask it to go out and find me the 10 most relevant patents that are the closest to X, you know, product. And then I've got those, and then I can say, okay, now go out and get me who are the patent holders for these. And, it just multiplies my power. And so I find that there are times in some of the work that I do, Johnny, where I might have 4 or 5 tabs up in my browser of my AI tool, and each one of them is working on a separate task. And, I'm a bit of a ADD kind of guy, so I can multitask fairly effectively, but there are moments that I have multiple tabs, and in one we're writing emails, in another one I'm putting candidate profiles together, and another one the notes that we took during the meeting where I interviewed somebody are being summarized, and then I'm able to copy, paste, clip, and put those things together to create the best candidate packages that I've seen in my career, coming from right now recruiters who are really learning how to use the tools to take so much of that. I'm going to call it recruiter busy work. It's vital work. You have to do it, but it's amazing what we're starting to see out of some of the early adopters.
So you reminded me kind of back to those early days. We did say before we kicked off, we're going to be two guys doing this a long time talking about the old days, and that's okay. I want to share a kind of broad story from when I started off, which was, two things. When I would meet, I was working in a staffing agency, and when I would meet a hiring manager, I'd try and make sure it was on site, which meant taking the day to drive 2 hours to their factory, go meet them in their office, and then say, walk me around. Like I remember going to Dundalk in Ireland to the Heinz factory where they made frozen meals. And we had a meeting in the office about the accountant they were looking to hire. Then we walked the factory. And they walked me through the production process, pardon me, which really helped me understand the cost accountant role. So I'd invest hours, a whole day in that part of it. And then when I'd interview candidates, we used to bring folks into our interview rooms. We'd limited number of interview rooms, and I'd spend an hour and 30 minutes in every interview, deeply discussing stuff with candidates, which was way over time. My colleagues were like, "Get out of the interview rooms, Johnny. We need the space." In today's world, where recruiters are sometimes overwhelmed with recs, you can't spend a whole day per hiring manager. You can't spend an hour and 30 minutes on your first conversation with a candidate. They're under so much pressure because of all those administrative tasks you mentioned, Jeff, that probably didn't exist when we started in recruiting. You didn't have to do Boolean searches, LinkedIn stuff. I don't know what we were doing, but we weren't doing that. We were spending more time talking to the businesses that we were recruiting for and talking to the candidates that we were trying to hire or place. And somewhere along the way that flipped. You mentioned some really good tools, Leah, the LinkedIn hiring assistant. You talked about some of Paradox's tools, I think are amazing. Fountain have good stuff as well in there. Lots of different providers. Eightfold, we've got Pavan Kumar coming on the show in a couple of weeks. Pavan was telling me about how he is using, because he's the VP of TA there, and he's customer zero for Eightfold's tools. And he's going to come and talk about how they're using agents to interview engineers in India. And he's hired, last time we spoke a week or so ago, 70 engineers through AI interviews at a high level, which I was kind of blown away by. And he talks about the volume of interviewing they can do through AI interviews, which I'm still skeptical of, but I'm hearing good stories. And you think of all this productivity that you can gain with these tools, that gives you, to your point, that time back, right? So we want to get that time back because we're talking about the value add, right? So if you're starting here, right, if you're kind of, we get it. We want to be value added. We want to, put the right tools in place to give the time back. Not every recruiter is going to survive this. Where does one start? Like maybe we'll speak to two different types of audience, Jeff, here. You're a recruiting leader. Where do I start? You're a recruiter. Where do I start? What would your advice be?
Wow, loaded question. I'm just going to jot down a note here so I don't forget it, because I want to make sure I hit this, because and I'm a recruiting leader. So let me I'm just going to walk back in time to a similar situation, Johnny, that you had. One of the tasks that I was given early on in my career was recruiting people who had backgrounds in nuclear engineering, because I was recruiting for a nuclear site that was being decommissioned, and they were having to tear down buildings and dig up soil and get rid of that contaminated materials. And I didn't know anything about it. And I just like I drove 4 hours to the location. I spent 2 days on site. I learned what vitrification was, which was melting all of that stuff into glass. And then that glass was how they were going to store the waste. And it was just an incredible experience to be on site and experience that. And I don't think recruiters today get to have many of those types of opportunities that you and I have had, a lot of times on the cost side, but a lot of it's just we don't have time to send them out and let them experience that. But just like you, it allowed me to have a peer-to-peer conversation with candidates and even managers, because I understood the business better than even some of their HR professionals who'd never gone on site and experienced that. So if I were walking in today with the tools that sit there in the world today, if I'm on the corporate side, you know, corporations want to adopt the AI, but those that work in highly regulated industries, they've got to be really careful. There's a lot of risk avoidance that they're trying to get after. And so I think that if I were walking in today as a recruiter, I would be identifying the tools that I would be allowed to use, first of all, within the confines of the organization that I was in. And there are some tools that I would probably be using just on my own, where I wouldn't be putting anything proprietary into the tool, but I could be using it to get that information. So instead of driving from Boise, Idaho to, the Tri-Cities of Washington, several hours away to go learn what vitrification is, I could take that word and I could do a deep dive with AI, and I could learn the business at a rapid rate without ever going on site. I could tell AI to pretend for a moment that you're a nuclear engineer and that you've been tasked with da 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 da, da, right? And I could craft the prompt that puts me in a situation where I'm walking into my initial meeting with the hiring manager and I already have significant knowledge, and I haven't had to put anything proprietary, anything that's a risk to the organization into an AI tool, which is where a lot of that risk mitigation is right now on that side. If I were a recruiting leader, I would be early adopting to be able to illustrate and demonstrate to my teams the art of what's possible with what they do have access to. But then I would probably be spending 25% of my time investigating tools and looking for what is the right fit for my company. Alpha AI, one of the companies out there that's done some great things with Lisa, it's an AI recruitment interview tool. I mean, it could go multiple languages. So just like what you're talking about with, you said it was eightfold that was doing, or
That's
I
right.
mean,
Eightfold.
I now can put an AI agent to do a basic interview in multiple languages. I mean,
Mhm.
right now, there are moments that I'm asked to hire a quadlingual linguist almost. I somebody will say, I need you to hire a recruiter that's going to recruit for X company, and they're going to need to have German, Polish, English, and then we also need them, if they can, to speak French. And you go out, that's just a unicorn of a person. But now I've got AI tools that, if I invest in the right tools, I have that initial screening capability with those tools. I mean, we're here at Hudson this week. We're super excited. We're launching Hudson Fusion, which is, our we've been in technology, but this is a huge leap into the future of where AI hiring platforms are going with, embedded advisory. And so we're really excited. This week we'll there'll be some press and so forth about that. We're pretty jazzed to see what happens. And we're launching our Talent IQ product, which is this deeper level of talent intelligence that allows organizations to do research through our AI tools that would have taken them weeks to figure out where are the talent pools, where are the right places for us to invest in this strategic place that we want to go as an organization. So, as a recruiting leader, I'd be spending a lot of time looking at the tools, but I would have to put myself in a position to be an early adopter so that I can model for my recruiters where they're going, what needs to happen in their careers. But at a minimum, for the advisory side of things, there's nothing proprietary about, going out and asking AI to give me a table of what you think the projected salaries are of certain kinds of roles in certain geographies. And with that information, I at least have some level of power then to come in and speak from a position of consultative authority with a hiring manager. A lot of times, and it's maybe a pet peeve and I might be exposing a little too much here, but so many times I see business professionals who think they know how to be great recruiters, and they think they're smarter than the recruiter that's sitting there across the desk from them or on the Zoom meeting. And and oftentimes I think we've done that to ourselves. We've done that to ourselves because we don't walk in the door armed with, oh, well, let me walk you through my understanding of the vitrification process. And if I understand that correctly, you're going to be needing to look for engineers that have experience in X and Y. And to have a hiring manager look at you with their mouth gaping open saying, how do you know this? Well, I've done some research because I wanted to make sure. I mean, I'm your eyes. I'm your first set of eyes to take care of a lot of work that you don't need to be doing so you can be focused on the main thing. And when you get into that relationship, the level of trust gets to a spot that, you get to where the two or three candidates that you put forward in your first slate, you're hitting 80% of the time with a hire because you have become such an empowered consultant. And I think that's where the future is for the really, really good recruiters. And for the rest, they're gonna struggle because there are tools coming to take their jobs.
Jeff, I could take so many of these topics and go down a rabbit hole, but we're nearly at time. And I thought maybe an appropriate way to end might be to ask you, and because I'm really keen to understand your view on this, Jeff, because we haven't talked about this before. Where do you think the world of RPO, recruitment process outsourcing organizations, is going? What excites you about the future of RPO in an AI empowered value creation world?
Wow, what a great question. I'm gonna go back to the reason I hired RPO the first time. I was in an organization where it was, I would call it the Wild West. Everybody was using their friend that had an agency that they golfed with, and we were paying literally into the tens of thousands of dollars per hire for people to maintain that relationship they had with that local, friend of theirs that had their own little agency. I think that where we're heading, I think where this industry, the recruitment industry, is heading, is that the companies that move towards the cost efficiencies that can be gained, we will become the companies that are hired by organizations that have some level of risk aversion, where they aren't quite sure how to go play in that space. They maybe have regulatory concerns, and they want to come to an organization that has done the research, has figured out how to use the tools in an ethical way. And I think that that's where we're going to see it. I think that there will be some contraction. I mean, there has been over the last couple of years in the RPO business, there's been some contraction. And I think that's more economics
Hmm.
than it is the AI revolution. But I think as we come out of it, as economies improve and hiring returns to what I would call its more historical norm, that's where I think the RPO companies are going to be able to be strategic weapons for large organizations, because we've got these people who have been trained, who know how to use a variety of AI tools, and we can walk in the door with a Hudson Fusion or other companies with whatever their solutions are, and we can help an organization reduce cost, improve their quality of hire, decrease their time to hire, And all of those things will still be at play. The only difference between 10 years ago or 15 years ago and today is the type of tools that are being used. Because 10 or 15 years ago, it was the RPO companies that were coming with the video interviewing technologies, or it was the RPO companies who were coming with some of the personality assessment type technologies. And so the companies were hiring us because RPOs were on the cutting edge of where the technology was going. And TA leaders, and this I found when I was global head of talent acquisition in an organization, I didn't have time to keep up with all the technologies. I mean, if I would have answered every inquiry coming from vendors, I would have never been able to do my work. But at the same time, I knew there were technologies I needed to adopt. And so by going at that time to an RPO, I was able to put myself in a position that we were bringing in technologies I didn't even know existed, but that organization had already been able to weave those together into a cohesive kind of basket of goods that allowed us to, reduce time to hire by 20 some days. At the end of that year, we'd put $20 million of revenue potential realization into the company's books. And so when we talked about cost per hire going from where it was in the mid 10,000 to 20,000 range of what we were doing to well below 5,000 per hire, it was RPO that did that. And it was RPO that knew how to do that because that's what they do. That's their bread and butter. That's what we do here at Hudson. That's what some of our, peer companies out there do as well. We work on the efficiency of the function to provide high value to organizations.
I'm going to close out on Jeff, Strategic Weapon Bettinger. I really thank you for joining us today. I am witness to your investment in learning and capability building in your own team. I'm excited for your future and your business's future because I see the investment you're making, as you say, in the tools you believe everyone should be looking at, the productivity and the strategic focus. You've given me tons of food for thought today, hopefully your audience as well. Jeff, good luck with the new products. I'm excited for the future, excited to continue working with you, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Johnny, and appreciate you and your team. Fantastic team of social talent.
Thank you. And thanks to our audience for joining us. Thank you, the listener. If you enjoyed today's show and you don't already subscribe, please do so on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. We'll be back again next week with another excellent show with another brilliant guest like Jeff to share their vision or future of hiring excellence. Until then, have a great week. Talk to you next week.